All right, now we're going to move on to our next work of Byzantine architecture. This is a great architectural structure to compare to what we've been looking at in Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia. So we need to take a minute and see if there's anything you recognize in this image that might be similar to what we looked at in the Hagia Sophia. What are the elements that you see drawing inspiration from the Hagia Sophia? I mentioned before the Hagia Sophia was this huge architectural project. So a lot of architects and artists after its construction are going to look to it as inspiration. So we're going to see that manifest. And this is a great example of that, and is a really interesting comparison to the Hagia Sophia. So we'll talk a little bit more about it, but take a minute, see if you recognize anything, and then we'll get into the specifics. All right, so this is San Vitale. This is a church located in Ravenna, Italy. So you have to think that Constantinople, which is again all the way in Turkey, so this is a very far distance away from Italy. Um, Constantinople is acting as this inheritor of the Roman Empire, but a Christian version of it, right? Christianity being the dominant religion, and then Ravenna, Italy. Um, at the time, remember we talked about the fall of the Roman Empire, there were barbarian hordes, as they get called. Really, there's civilizations predominantly in like the kind of modern German parts of Europe and France are conquering these areas. And Ravenna, Italy specifically is a city that gets um, basically the Byzantines and it's the Visigoths are, I'm pretty sure, oh, the Ostrogoths. I always get them all mixed up, but the Ostrogoths and the Byzantines get into a battle. The Byzantines win. So these Christians win, and then they take this city back. And that is a big deal for them because Rome was seen as this really important center of religious activity and early Christianity. And then when it fell to these other empires, basically, that was a big loss. So the fact that they got this city back was really important. And so they wanted to cement this Christian influence in this western part of the Byzantine Empire. So this grand church gets built, San Vitale, and that's what we're looking at here, with with efforts to largely be inspired by the type of architecture and art being done in Constantinople, right, which is really the center city of this Byzantine Empire. So Justinian is the emperor at this time, and we talked about Justinian because he was an important person in the commissioning and building of the Hagia Sophia. Um, and he doesn't actually come to Ravenna, but he plays an important part of this construction taking place and being, again, like establishing this Christian architecture in the western part of Europe that, you know, was mostly other civilizations were ruling at the time. This is an octagonal structure similar to what we saw at the Hagia Sophia. Again, we don't have this axial plan again, which is that like elongated plan, but this central plan where we have this almost like circular structure. It's an octagonal structure, but we still have a cross shape that you see. You still have the narthex, you still have the nave, you have the aisles on the outside, then you have the apse at the very end where the altar is going to be. So we see a combination of Roman and Byzantine elements. We have the dome, we have mosaics, which are very much from a Roman tradition, which a lot of, again, Byzantine was inspired a lot by Roman elements. And then when we think about Byzantine elements or sort of uniquely Byzantine elements, you can look at the column capitals, which were very much inspired by the Hagia Sophia. Remember, they're like kind of airy and like trying to look weightless. We'll look at like a closer picture in a minute. We also have the inclusion of flying buttresses. I don't think I mentioned that with the Hagia Sophia, but that was something that started to become used more and more. It was a way, basically, the flying buttresses are these supporting structures on that exterior of a church, which you can see them in this top picture here, uh, protruding out. And this is a way to support like taller buildings. You're going to see that a lot when we get to Gothic architecture, in kind of later parts of Christian architecture. Anyways, but flying buttresses become important, allowing for bigger, airier interior spaces. Because again, if you don't have a ton of columns right in the middle of a space, there's nothing to support the roof. So the weight has to go somewhere. So by adding flying buttresses, you have it basically going on the exterior of the church. So, similar to the Hagia Sophia, we have a pretty plain exterior. We don't have like any carvings or any, it's not like decorated. It's just kind of the construction. Really, The focus is meant to be on the interior of the space. Lots of mosaics on the inside, though. If you, on the previous image, if you were doing that comparison between the Hagia Sophia and San Vitale, I hope you noticed that there's just like a ton of mosaics, which you see in both of these both of these structures. We're going to look at really specifically at a mosaic of Emperor Justinian, Empress Theodora in a couple of slides. That's going to give us an idea of what kind of narratives and what kind of things. And we're going to look at a couple other mosaics as well. So, it's important. One of the reasons San Vitale is so interesting and important is because it's really the only true Byzantine style architectural structure in Rome, or really anywhere in Western Europe from this era that still exists, because any other structures that were built like this were either redone over time, and then the other thing is there wasn't a ton of them, right? Because the Byzantine Empire, while it did eventually expand, there was other civilizations, right? So this is very unique for what it's showing us, the type of architecture that was being constructed at this time. Lots of windows, lots of light being let in. Remember, that becomes a big theme in Christianity. Light equates, this idea of God, connection to God. So this is like a big the incorporation of light is very symbolic, and the structure, it's not just supposed to be functional, is what I mean, is that it's all supposed to be very symbolic of like lots of light in here means it's a spiritual space. Thin columns. So again, we have this sense of airiness. We have this sense of, it's people looking in this space would get the sense of like, how do these really thin columns support something so tall? It's almost, again, this symbolism of like, well, God's holding it up. Like there's just this sense that they're trying to make it look unbelievable in how it's constructed. This particular church operated similar to when we looked before at a martyrium, which is a place to mark um, the martyrdom of a saint. San Vitale. Interestingly enough, there's multiple San Vitale, so we don't exactly know which one this is in reference to, but it was meant to be a place, like a site where this saint was martyred, and commemorating that event. Here is a mosaic that is found in the interior of San Vitale. This gives you a sense again of this, first off, the fact that mosaics become a central artistic form. A big thing that I feel like I haven't emphasized enough so far is one of the things in Byzantine art and architecture is when you think about Greek and Roman art, and particularly sculpture and narrative, anything that involves like a human body, let's say, there was a really distinct emphasis on realism, right? Like, you see the musculature, you see veins, you see everything is meant to look very realistic. That was their goal. They thought the closer you got to realism, the better the art would be, right? That was sort of the perception. Here you can see that that's not really the concern, and it's not that that means that they couldn't do it, but it's perhaps showing a shift in priorities in the type of art that is being depicted. Now, when you think about it, why is there not really an interest in like this perfect representation of human forms? Well, a lot of the people and a lot of the narratives and the scenes we're looking at are portraying things that are not rooted in like a lived experience all the time, right? We're seeing depictions of God, we're seeing depictions of angels, we're not only gods and angels and these heavenly things, but also a sense of those things being timeless. So the more realistic you made something, the more it almost lends itself to looking like if you depict a human body very realistically, then you might start to think of that human body as a mortal body, right? Like if you show the veins, if you show the body, like it gives the sense of like, oh, well, like bodies with veins and musculature bleed and they die, right? Whereas when you're trying to depict God, that's not the emphasis you want to place, right? You want to place that there's this timelessness, this eternal. So we see more abstracted versions of these forms. And especially if you're looking at the backgrounds of these images, if you look at these mosaics, more often than not, you're going to see these gold backgrounds or some sort of background where you're not located anywhere definitively, right? It's like you're depicting heaven, you're depicting this immortal realm, something that's not You can't point to it and say, like, this is exactly the place you're looking at. And that's meant to convey this idea of eternity, right? Like that heaven is not a particular place that you can point to. It's like this eternal thing that you can't even depict in art because it's so above our lived mortal world, I guess. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, so here's a great example of that. You have God, really the Christ figure here, who is depicted with a halo with the cross on it. He's sitting on this blue orb, often interpreted to be like earth of some form, the ruler of earth. Again, sitting on this globe, sitting on this earth. Um, and then you have this amorphous gold background that really doesn't, it's not any particular place. It's like he's just floating in this eternal gold immortal realm. And you have on the right hand of God, in this image of the right hand of God, you have a depiction of an angel, and you have well, I have slides that'll describe all this, but Saint Ecclesias, who was the bishop at the time that this church was built, San Vitale, and he's presenting a small version of San Vitale, which we saw an example of that when we looked at Hagia Sophia. We saw the picture of Justinian presenting the Hagia Sophia to Jesus, and then you saw a depiction of Constantine presenting Constantinople, or like the city walls, as like a gift to God. On the other side, you have a depiction of San Vitale, who this building is dedicated to, being crowned and robed by an angel. So crowned by Jesus and robed by an attendant angel here. Here are examples of the columns that I mentioned. Again, weightless, being inspired by the Hagia Sophia. So you can directly see how these columns are influenced by this Byzantine style as opposed to what's happening in Rome and Roman styles of art and architecture and column capitals and things like that. And then you can see where all these mosaics would be over the tympanum. You see them really everywhere on the walls of this space. Here's another uh, depiction of this mosaic that I was just talking about, depicting Christ and Saint Ecclesias and San Vitale. And it's located in this like kind of half dome area above these windows. And again, light plays such an important part. It's not just functional, because the other thing to think about is these mosaics, which were done with these really precious gems, gold work, cobalt, right? Like all of these things that would glow and illuminate with light hitting them. If you put these windows directly beneath it, it's going to illuminate those mosaics and just make them shine really brilliantly. I want you to also make a note here, or look on the very bottom left-hand side. You'll notice a picture, a mosaic, and I want you to note there's that mosaic there, and then there's going to be one directly across from it on this side. And those two images are going to be images that we're going to look at on the next slide. So I just want you to make note of like the location where those mosaics are. So here you have one on this side, and we have one on this side. Spoiler alert, the one on this side is Emperor Justinian, and then on the other side is his consort, his wife, Theodora. So let's talk about that. All right, these are our next mosaics that we're looking at, and I gave a little bit of a preview, or I mentioned the location of these mosaics. So I want you to take a minute and look at this. We're going to look at the other one. So if we're breaking this down just from like without really understanding what's going on, let's just take a look at what we're looking at. So we have this central figure who's a female figure with many other female attendants. You'll probably notice that this sort of center, she's a little bit to the left, image of this female seems to be the most important figure. And we can make those assumptions because she has the most elaborate costuming on her clothes on. She has this very elaborate robe. She actually has a halo around her head. Nobody else in this image has a halo around their head. So that gives you the sense as well that this is somebody important, possibly connections to divinity of some sort. She's holding something. We'll talk about what that is. She's holding some sort of cup or bowl or something of that sort. Tons of jewelry, right? I mean, there's just like she's literally dripping in jewels and precious stones. And then you'll notice that they're on their way into this area that has this curtain. If we're looking at the style here, again, mosaic, we have it's interesting because we'll compare this to the other image. This image seems a little bit more rooted in some sort of location. We do have a gold background, but we do have architecture that's framing the female figure as well as a little bit of architecture framing the right hand side and the left hand side. So there's a little bit less of that like timeless timeless realm that we see in depictions of like Christ, for example. But we still have a little bit of that because we do have a gold background. So just that's a plain observation of what we're looking at. Now we're going to look at the other one and do a similar observation or analysis. Oh, here's some close-ups. I just find the clothes alone, the amount of detail and the amount of differentiation in the clothing is just so interesting, especially when we're thinking about how little when you look at the faces and you look at the bodies, there's no anatomical representation. There's really no interest in having any realism in the anatomy. You don't see any musculature, you don't see any, these are kind of just like pretty simple shapes, but the detail in the decoration is the opposite, right? It's like it's almost just a complete shift, right? Like a lot of the Greek and Roman sculptures and statues were all about anatomy, but really not a lot of decoration. And then here we have just like this polar opposite shift of like it's, not really interested in the anatomy, but lots of design involved. Anything else I want to point out? Yeah, the just spectacular work. You can see how much time and energy would have taken to make something like this. Even if you look at the robe of the main, like the protagonist in this image here, there's this scene being represented, these three figures. We're going to talk about that, but even that has like shading and like not, I shouldn't say shading, but like different colors to show the form a little bit, which I think is fascinating, the detail in just the decor and like the design of the clothing. This is the other mosaic that would have been basically directly across from the one that we just looked at. So there was this image here, and then this is on the other side. Here we have a very much central figure, similar to this protagonist in the other image. Clearly, they are the most important figure. Halo, purple robes. It looks like a little darker, but it would have been intended as purple. It probably has deteriorated in its shine over time, but this purple robe, gold work everywhere. The space, again, very gold, timeless, similar to the depictions of Christ. You have several attendants. You'll notice that the attendants are split a little bit. There's particular types of attendants. On one side, you have one attendant holding a cross, another holding a book, another holding what is like an incense carrier. And the other side, you have some attendants, like two similar, and then on the opposite side of that, um, well, the two in the white robes aren't holding anything, and then the rest of them all have spears and a shield. So I want you to just make that differentiation here. Again, the central figure, highly decorative, lots of jewels, precious stones, giving us the sense that this person is of incredible wealth. And then this central person is also holding a bowl. So keep all of that in mind as we unpack each of these images. So the figure with the central male figure is Justinian. So Justinian, we've talked about a lot, very important Christian ruler who commissioned lots of important architectural and art projects. And you'll notice that Justinian here is in the center, and he has two types of attendants. On the right-hand side, he has clergy, so religious leaders, and on the left, he has military leaders. So we're showing this duality of Justinian as a leader. He says, I am dually capable of leading spiritually and leading militarily. So there's this duality to the type of leader he perceives himself as. There's this symmetrical composition, so he's very much right in the middle, showing that he's the important person, he is the leader, the number one. The way that the figures are conveyed, I've mentioned before, is like not really realistic, and you can see that also in the way perspective is done. Their feet are not really flat on any sort of stable surface, so they seem to almost float a little bit. That is again showing not skill wise that they can't do this. It's purely this transition away from that being the most important element, right? The decor, the design becomes more interesting and emphasized in these types of images. Justinian is robed in purple and gold, and he bears a halo. All of these things show him as semi-divine, but like very much royalty, right? There's this like ambiguous. Like he's not God, but he's not a mortal man, right? There's this ambiguity shown here. Flat golden background, we've talked about that. Faces are standardized. So if you look at all the figures, except for really Justinian and then one of the clergy, everybody else is very standard, especially the soldiers all look the same. There's not really an attempt to differentiate them, meaning that it's not meant to be any particular people, just, the people in his leadership, in his, who he rules. He's also showing a paten, which is a shallow bowl. This is what would be used for the Eucharist. So within early Christianity, the Eucharist is a ritual. It's something that is it's basically symbolic of events that happen in the or in the New Testament related to Jesus. So this is a ritual that takes place, and so this object would have been seen as synonymous with that ritual that takes place in a church. So it shows that he is regularly participating in this and potentially here, like leading that service. So again, shows his spiritual power. On the right, we have a depiction of Theodora and her attendants. So Theodora is the wife of Justinian. You can see clearly that she's the queen. She's the most important female figure in this kingdom, but she's also not the most important figure. She's not quite central. She does have this halo behind her. But again, I think it's so interesting to compare him being in this eternal realm like Jesus is conveyed, but she's very much located in an architectural space, grounding her in reality a little bit more. So she's not as divine, maybe, as Justine, or that's the implication. So she's flanked by her court, and she's holding a chalice. So during the Eucharist, during the ritual, there is a partaking of symbolism of the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. So you have something eaten and something that you drink. So he's holding the part for the eating portion. She's holding the chalice, which would be used for the drinking portion. And she is, again, highly ornamented, all the things that we've been talking about. And that image that you see at the bottom of her robe is actually a depiction that comes from also the New Testament, the scriptures related to Jesus. There's a story of the three magi. So these people who come to celebrate the birth of Jesus. This is something you see this symbolism a lot in Christmas celebrations. And so you have this really distinct depiction of that as well in her robe. So again, these things are not meant to be about the body or depictions of anatomy or there's not this perception that better art is more associated with realism. It's really about the narrative, being pious, devotional imagery relating to spirituality, and then design becomes really important. There's an abstraction here that we're seeing, a move away from naturalism towards abstraction. That's a big thing that you're going to see in this transition into Byzantine art and architecture, really art more so. Anytime you do an analysis of any civilization, if you can find books or text or something along those lines, that gives you a really big insight into what the civilization is interested in, what culture, what people are sitting down and reading, what images they're looking at. So far, we haven't been able to look at a ton of books or text or things like that because a lot of that can deteriorate over time, get lost over time. So when we get to the Byzantine Empire, we do start to see, and we have up until this point had books and texts and things like that, but a lot of it has been lost. So this is a great opportunity we have to spend some time looking at text, early books, and how these things function with images. So this is a really good example. This is known as the Vienna Genesis. This is a page from the Vienna Genesis. So it really would have been a larger collection of pages that would have, again, been a book, basically. This is an illuminated manuscript. So what an illuminated manuscript means is basically it's a text that has images accompanying it, which the images help tell the story of what the text is saying. So think of it as like a picture book or something, but for adults, to tell the story of whatever the text is telling about. So what we're looking at is an illuminated manuscript that specifically is scriptural text. So we're seeing text that is scripture, and then the images are showing or yeah, showing what's happening in those scriptures. So this page that we have here is a great example of showing Byzantine styles and how things have changed and are changing. Again, we are having this move away from classical conventions. And when we say classical conventions, we're talking about Greek and Roman conventions into late antiquity, into Christian conventions. Okay. So this is such an interesting image because it's really combining the two. And we'll get into that of what exactly that means. So when I say that, when you look at the way the composition is formed here, even if you have known nothing about the story, nothing about, the narrative being told, you can tell there's very different depictions of figures here. We have a figure in a pink dress who is Rebecca is the character here, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But you can see that she's depicted sort of in a Byzantine style, right? Like not a lot of modeling of shape. Her clothes become a little bit more important, but we also have this other female figure here who's actually meant to be like a goddess figure, representative of the body of water that you see. And oftentimes bodies of water would be represented through like a depiction of a goddess or something in Greek and Roman art. So it's this really funny juxtaposition because we have this nude female figure who is a goddess, who is like a symbol basically, and then you have this actual scriptural figure who is done in more of this like Byzantine style. So this is a great example of that combination of the two. So we see foreshortening, contrapposto, perspective, being used. These are all classical conventions, attempts towards realism. But we also see that this attempt at perspective is pretty shallow, and then the backgrounds are don't have ground lines, and there's no atmospheric perspective. Um, we also so all of those things give us a sense that this is Byzantine. So again, we're in this transition period between the two. An illuminated manuscript, like I said, is basically a text that has images supporting the text to show what's going on. But one thing to keep in mind is when you think about books or illuminated manuscripts or anything like that at this time, printing hadn't been invented yet. So all of this has to be handwritten. And if you take any book in your house and imagine the time it would take to handwrite the whole thing, that's going to take time, right? It's a lot longer than if you're printing something. So anytime you're making a book or a text, it is going to be a labor-intensive process. Okay. So already just the fact that it's a text means it's labor-intensive. Add on top of it the fact that this particular one we're looking at is made from purple vellum, which vellum is basically like early paper that was made using the skin of animals. So think about the labor it would have taken to take an animal, to kill it, to take the skin, to stretch it, to dry it, right? Like that's going to take a whole process. And each animal isn't going to produce just endless pages. There's going to, only so much skin to make so many pages. And then on top of that purple vellum, which this doesn't look purple, it looks more brown. It was dyed purple originally. It's lost a lot of its pigmentation over time. Would have had written a silver pen basically would have been how the text would have been written. So originally it would have been this bright purple with silver text on top, and the silver would have been written in real silver, and that oxidized over time. So that's why it looks black now. But purple is a very hard color to come by in this time and to dye things with it. Vellum is hard to make. Silver is hard to come by and is a very expensive material to write. And writing a whole book itself takes labor. So all of those things combined together tell us that this image that we're looking at, this object, would have been extremely expensive and very time consuming to produce. So this is not just like looking at any book. This is like a highly luxurious, expensive thing that we're looking at. Okay. So that's why I just want to emphasize to you that this is a luxury product. Very few people would have had access to something like this. Um, we only have 48 of the 192 pages of the manuscript surviving. Again, over time, things like fall apart or they get moved and then they get lost and whatever. But these are all the whole thing was meant to be an illuminated manuscript describing the events of Genesis, which is the first book of the Old Testament, the first book of the Bible, basically. So a very important book for Christians. We're looking here, and we're going to look at a couple other pages, and all of them are continuous narrative. A continuous narrative is kind of like a comic book. We've talked about continuous narrative before, but it's like a comic book of where like you'll see the same figure over and over again doing different things to show the passage of time, even in just like the same image. So here you can see two women in like pink dresses. That's the same person. That's both Rebecca. And I have another page where we can look at the narrative. On the image on the left, you have another picture or another illuminated manuscript or section of illuminated manuscript telling the story of Jacob wrestling the angel, another story from the Old Testament. Basically, it's a story of Jacob and his wives and his children who are escaping and they go over this bridge and then you have him wrestling an angel and we don't need to get into like the specifics of the story, but all of the elements of this story, this every person you see here is not like a different person, but there's repetition of the same people over and over again as a continuous narrative. And then on the right we have Rebecca who is at a river with her camel. It's another story from the Old Testament that is important. But again, both of these are showing a combination of Roman classical styles that are coming out of style basically into Byzantine styles. I mentioned this at the beginning of us talking about the Byzantine Empire, but there became a time during the Byzantine Empire that became known as the Byzantine iconoclasm. Now, iconoclasm, I think I've talked about this before, is essentially the idea of image breaking, destroying images deliberately for some sort of spiritual reason, or, political reason. It could be a lot of different reasons, right? Like a lot of different civilizations have done this. And during this time, there became this controversy or this debate theologically of do images offer a problem for Christians because they become worshipped over the God that they're supposed to be worshiping. So this becomes controversial. And a lot of Christians engage in active image breaking, meaning, as a form of my devotion, I'm going to destroy this image because it's taking precedence over my devotion or whatever. So during this time period, in the 700s to the 800s, from an art historical perspective, it's really interesting because you just kind of have this blank moment of like images, we just don't have them anymore. They're not being made, or they're being destroyed, or they're being done in secret. And so, and a lot of those have been lost to time. So we just have this really strange moment where we don't have these things, or the things that we have even show active destruction. If you notice this image I have on here, the figure on the bottom holding the spear, the face has been scratched out, and this person is actually actively scratching out an image of Christ. And it looks, kind of sacrilegious or something, but it's really just documenting what happened at this moment. Um, so a lot of the depictions that we see, we really don't have a lot of things left from this time. And it also shows a big shift in the depictions of Christ from being um, sometimes more, like the shepherd Christ or like this young image of Christ becomes more and more godlike and unknowable. That's sort of the direction that images of Jesus take later. It's also historically important because it really contributed to a split between Roman Catholic Christianity and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which I won't go into the specifics of that. But that does become a central issue in this debate. We do have this really fabulous example of a Byzantine icon. Now, the word icon we've talked about is really just an image used for worship. And it's interesting to think about it now because when we say someone's like an icon, iconic, we think about celebrities. And in large part, that verbiage towards celebrities and things like that have been used um, very much because a lot of people maybe not think of it this way, but almost worship images of celebrities and things like that. Like people are always looking at images and things like that. So you can see sort of parallels between the two. But the image we have here is fairly unique because, again, at this time, we see a deliberate destruction and active non-art making at this time. This particular object was found in Sinai, Egypt, which was an area that was part of the Byzantine Empire. But because it was geographically pretty far away from other things going on, that's part of the reason that this one survived. It's also an encaustic painting on wood, which is also extremely hard to come by because wood images very, very often are not preserved well over time. So the image that we're looking at here is a depiction of Virgin and Child between Saints Theodore and George. So this is an icon image. It's meant to be like worshipped, a devotional image. It was found in a monastery, or was preserved by a monastery. So this would have been something used by monks in worship. Encaustic is a type of art making or painting that was done using colored wax. So if you think like candle wax and you put pigments in it and then you melt it down, apply heat, and then you put it on, and then it hardens into the shape. So, imagine doing that in an encaustic method would be really difficult. But so clearly the people creating this were very skillful. And I say people because it is believed to have been possibly made by multiple people because there's a couple different styles that we see here. So yeah, this is very rare because a lot of images were destroyed during this Byzantine iconoclasm. So we have these stiff front-facing people. We have, it's not really like a naturalistic depiction of bodies. It's not really naturalistic and it's very stiff. Not a lot of interest in classical modeling, except for we do have these two angels at the very top that kind of turn their heads. That's like an interesting anomaly here. It's very different from the other faces that we're seeing, which is again another reason people think multiple people might have made this. We do have a sense of divine order, that everything is organized. We have warrior saints, George and Theodore, on either side of Mary and Jesus. And you'll also notice that there's a hand descending from the very top. Is that kind of like the image very at top? That's supposed to be the hand of God, um, uh, kind of bestowing the image. And we also see a really fantastic depiction of the Christ figure. And it's funny because there's not, it's odd because we have a lot of images of Christ at this time that depict him very much looking like a tiny version of an adult, right? I mean, here he literally looks kind of middle-aged. I mean, he has a like receding hairline, which is funny to think about. And some people think it's because they just like couldn't depict babies, but that's not really true. There's certainly skill here, but often scholars will debate or argue this point. But there's a sense that when you think about Christ, him as a child being born is important, but really like his ministry as an adult is very much emphasized. So this idea that he was born knowing, having wisdom, so him being this like middle-aged man as a baby kind of makes sense to give him the sense that he was this divinely ordained child that was coming into the world to become this important person. So that's Byzantine art and architecture for our unit.